Hello, and thanks for listening to these stories of the strange, unexplained, and uncanny. I am John Harford, and I'll be your guide through these mists of Mirkwood. Most of us are facing quarantine due to the COVID-19 viral pandemic. For much of the Western world, this is the first time we've been challenged by this level of widespread lifestyle change. I hope everyone is safe and healthy. With a bit more time, I'm going to try to get an extra episode, even a short one, out about once a month. I'm considering a live episode in 2 weeks. We'll see how that goes. In the meantime, enjoy your trip from the world of the rational into the realm of shadow reality. In my previous episode, Steps Out of Time, I discussed photography as one of my main pursuits. Going into the out-of-the-way places, often alone, tends to automatically set up situations in which odd things may be perceived to occur. I teach photography at the college level, and indeed teach a lecture section on spirit and paranormal photography. When asked, I almost always reply that in my own experience I have only 2 or 3 unusual images, and perhaps 3 or 4 odd photographic experiences. These are out of my thousands of hours of shooting and thousands of resultant photographs. I'll talk about 2 of those incidences in this episode. I have a number of theories as to how or why a ghost could appear in photographs, particularly a photographic film negative. I talk a little bit about that in the previous episode, Metal of Sight. I've looked at a lot of paranormal, UFO, cryptid, ghost, photography, and video. I find it easy to dismiss all but a handful of edited clips. And even those that I consider possibly legitimate, if I don't see the source media firsthand, I tend to assume what is on the footage has been somehow misunderstood, contrived, or edited. I expect the same treatment of anything I present. Healthy skepticism is a way to legitimize the very rare occurrence of unusual happenings and unexplained photographic phenomena. There are a number of ghost photos that I consider my favorites. A number of them have been clearly debunked. Others are questionable. 1 or 2 are still possibly unexplained. But in any case, they remain my favorites. It has been famously quoted, "I want to believe." But with my knowledge of photography, particularly photo manipulation and editing, I find it really hard to be a true believer. The point that most true believers in paranormal photography seem to overlook is that you have to implicitly trust the source. And it is naive to assume that people who have the ability to fake and lie about a photo won't. I've indeed seen a number of clearly faked photos that the person presenting to me insisted were absolutely real. The only source I know I can implicitly trust is myself, and thus the only ghost photos that I can be assured that are at least strange and difficult to explain are the very few that have been shot by me. There are others who I entrust implicitly to not have some fun with creative editing, but that pool's very thin. As you probably expected, my tale begins in the Pine Barrens. It was fairly early on in my photography experiences, perhaps 1993 or 1994. I decided to shoot photos at Batsto village. This is a place in the Pine Barrens, an old village with quite a bit of historic architecture and equipment. It was originally the site of an ironworks in 1766. The ore that the local streams and cranberry bogs produced provided copious wood power to the forge. This made a perfect location to support this kind of industry in the otherwise extremely rural South Jersey. It changed hands and eventually was purchased by Joseph Wharton in 1876. Then it also became well known for cranberry farming and cedar milling. The keystone of the village is the massive Batsto mansion, which rises up and gives a grand overlook of the surrounding Wharton State Forest. It is now a living history museum that is open for self-guided wandering and scheduled tours of the mansion. There are also several nature trails leading out from the town. On these paths, you can wander along the edges of the cranberry bogs and soak in the rich aroma of the cedar forest. Especially in high summer, the place not only feels humid, but you are perfumed by the fragrant air that seems to cling long after you've left the forest. The water of the creeks and bogs has a rusty orange tint, traces of oxidization of the rich metals beneath the surface. All throughout Wharton State Forest can be found the ruins of the ironworks, brick chimneys, foundations of furnaces, old bridges over creeks. The bricks near the water are often stained the color of fall leaves, picking up the tint of the iron-laced bogs. This particular part of South Jersey seems particularly stuck in time. Nearby is Chatsworth, once a major train stop through the woodlands. It was a stop with clubs and spas that at one time entertained wealthy New Yorkers and Philadelphians. Not far away, near the coastal town of Barnegat, can be found the Cedar Bridge Tavern, thought to be one of the oldest intact and operating pubs in the country. It's reportedly haunted by a former owner who can be heard walking the halls at night and occasionally opening and closing doors. Many of the earliest residents of the Pines were considered outlaws and bandits. It was rumored the local towns, at the earliest Quaker, then later strict Methodists, would banish shunned community members into the forests. Many of these places among the low flat pines and aside the rolling waves of the Atlantic have stories of strange happenings, but Batsto's history seems particularly quiet. A few clips and articles describe it as widely haunted, and so scary people are afraid to visit it. But the vast bulk of the visitors to Batsto have never reported any paranormal occurrence. If asked, some employees will anecdotally say that a few odd things have happened around the grounds, but it is not promoted and widely reported as a haunted location. I had been visiting the place on school trips and recreational adventures with friends and family since childhood. Indeed, when someone visiting South Jersey in the 1980s and 90s didn't want a mall, beach, or casino, there wasn't a plethora of culture and tourism. While old, it was never to me a particularly creepy or ominous location. It was an afternoon in early spring that I decided to go shoot at Batsto Village for the first time. It had been years since I had been there, and it seemed like a good day. Clear sky, seasonably warm air, it would be a great time to photograph some old buildings. I had parked in one of the small visitor lots away from the office and gift shop. I began wandering and shooting photos of the blacksmith shop, the mill, and restored homes that make up the bulk of the village. If I recall, there were no other visitors. It was a weekday afternoon, about 2 or 3 p.m. I walked across one of the large fields along a fence leading up to the manor house. I began shooting photos as I went. I got perhaps 100 yards from the house, and as I assessed a shot, that is when I noticed something strange. In the cupola appeared to be what I first thought was a person, or at least something like the shape of a person. If I looked hard enough, especially through my 210mm zoom lens, I thought I could vaguely make out features, but it was strange and indistinct. I looked at it for several seconds, and it seemed completely still. I got closer, as close as I could and still see up into the cupola, and there seemed to be facial hair and the impression of clothing, but it was all strangely blurry and a little bit indistinct. I absolutely thought maybe it was a cutout or something that had been hung in the cupola, or maybe it was a strange reflection on the glass. But the more I looked at it, now for well over a minute, the stranger it became. It seemed to shift now very subtly, almost like a projection. It was then that I took 2 shots, bracketing for exposure. I walked around the side of the house and looked from the side of the cupola. It wasn't visible at that angle, so I had to assume it was cornered in such a way that it was hidden from this point of view. I walked behind the house and also could not see it. Yet, when I walked to the front of the house, it was still visible, yet it seemed to have faded. No features were any longer discernible. It now seemed to just be a gray silhouette. I turned away and walked further back across the grass. At about 200 yards, I looked back and it was entirely gone. It dawned on me at the time that I was looking at something entirely unusual, though I was still erring on the side of it being some kind of strange optical illusion. Indeed, it still could have been. I continued to wander the grounds and photograph, occasionally glancing back up to the empty cupola. After about another hour, I walked to the visitor center and I spoke to them. I was fairly sure I had not seen a person in the window of the cupola, not a physical person anyway. But for my own satisfaction, I asked if the mansion was open for tours today. They replied no, and I just casually said that I thought I saw someone inside and I wanted to go in and photograph, and if there's any way that I could be let in. They firmly replied that it was closed and there was no one inside. I did not broach the discussion of phantoms. I left them with the impression that I was simply an eager photographer looking for a private tour. Needless to say, I was quite curious as to what I would find on the film. The following day I developed it. This was 400 ISO black and white T-Max film. I processed it entirely myself. I'm not sure how to articulate my thoughts when I printed the first 8x10 image from the negatives. I saw something unusual in the very spot where I had seen the figure. It was just misty grayness. Some would say maybe even a blur or a blob. There were no definable features in only vaguely definable form. But still, it was there. It was there where I had seen something. If you are watching the video version of this episode, you right now are seeing the photo. I'll point out a few things about it. I've circled where the form is. This is, of course, a digital scan directly from the negative. It has been unaltered except for contrast and exposure. The two negatives respond slightly differently to different adjustments, but both show the same thing. There appears to be some kind of shape or disruption exactly where I had seen this figure. Something else is odd. This wasn't apparent to me until a friend who looked at the photo pointed it out. Perhaps the strangest thing about this blob of light or mist seems to be that it is not only within the cupola, behind the window, but some portion of it also seems to be in front of the wooden frame. I've also circled that part and blown it up for you. I've had a number of people look at the image. Some have known more about photography than myself, a number less so. I've had a lot of valid suggestions. A reflection from another cupola window, or a refraction. But what was the light reflecting off of, or refracting through? It wasn't simply an artifact of the camera or development process, because I saw something there when I took the photograph, with both my naked eye and through a lens. I still thought perhaps an image of the person was somewhere in the cupola, and that the afternoon sun had caught it for a time when it shifted, or it was just a peculiarity of the light and my own imagination. Very early on, I happened to contact the Discovery Channel show Sightings. At their request, I scanned it and sent them a sample of the photo, which of course, in retrospect, probably wasn't a smart idea in terms of propriety. They contacted me within 24 hours of receiving the photo and indicated that their experts felt it was unusual in nature, and they wanted to run a story on it featuring my experience. The issue was, of course, they were interested in having me donate my time, story, and photograph for free. A year or so later, I returned to Batsto to take a tour of the mansion with a friend. I specifically asked the tour guide, jokingly, "Hey, do you have any ghosts in here?" She replied, "I've heard a few stories about people hearing and seeing things in here, but I've never run into a ghost." I didn't see a ghost that day, but I did manage to see an image of Joseph Wharton. And if I let myself, I would note his facial hair, and my own imagination would tell me that the painting looks not unlike the phantom in the cupola. One additional photographic oddity from Batsto. The images relating to the second story were unfortunately lost in a house fire, along with at least 100 other negatives in 1995. A couple of years later, while passing by Batsto Village, I decided to shoot a few photos. I went in and around the nearby Pleasant Mills Cemetery and churchyard. Nothing happened that was odd, aside from a vaguely creepy sensation when I shot a particular set of headstones, but I didn't think anything of it at the time. There were no strange sounds or visions, and I spent nearly an hour wandering around the graveyard and nearby woods. However, when I developed the photos, the only shots that didn't come out were those of that particular cluster of gravestones. Every other photo was fine, in terms of both completion and quality of exposure. The following week, I had to satisfy my curiosity. I returned and shot that same churchyard again. This time, the only photos that did come out on that roll of film, out of 36 shots, were the half a dozen images I took of those particular gravestones. A little addendum here. Long after I wrote the text for this episode, and even after I had finished recording it, I found an interesting note. I found a single source that references the hauntings of Batsto Village. The only notation is that, quote, "Visitors have sometimes reported a figure in the high windows of the mansion when it was otherwise empty," end quote. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed these personal strange accounts. Please like this video, assuming that you do. Subscribe to the channel and share these videos if you like them. I'm interested in any comments you have, and don't hesitate to say hello. You can also find us at www.mirkwood.com. That is Mirkwood with a Y. And on Facebook at our Mirkwood Tales page. Audio-only versions of the podcast are available at mirkwoodtales.podbean.com, iTunes, and other major streaming sites if you search for Mirkwood Tales. If you are listening to the podcast version, search for the video channel on YouTube called Mirkwood Tales. You'll get some additional content with the visuals. Got a tale you want to share with me and my listeners? Send me an email at tales@mirkwood.com. or through private message over at the Facebook page. Be safe, stay healthy, best wishes, and stay strange.